Alright, so in this segment we've been doing this month, where we go back and I look at older reviews and basically realize how I was off the mark on some cases, or I want to kind of re-explore maybe a little bit more. I went back to Tag for a couple of reasons. One of which being, I just happened to catch it on TV like a few months ago, and it just, something about it seemed more enjoyable and a little bit better than when I saw it in the theater back in 2018. And between that and revisiting Game Night like I've been doing, and we did a video on that at the beginning of this, I realized that comedies are just kind of a different thing in general. I know that's kind of obvious, but in the sense that they seem more susceptible to the idea of, if you don't like something right away, it's something that can kind of grow on you as you sort of continue to watch it. Because I've noticed when I do like the review videos when they first come out, I do seem like I don't really take to comedies right away a lot of the time. And I don't know if it's just like the expectation that comes with doing a video like that and like needing to be critical or whatever, but even though what the criticisms that I give movies, especially comedies, are sincere when I do, it does seem like when you take that context out of it, of, you know, having to do some sort of video that's critical about it or whatever, there's something much more easy to like about them. And like I said, the fact that they're just kind of made as escapism to begin with anyway, I do find when I go back to them, I care significantly less about those criticisms that I initially gave it, and it basically just becomes a movie at that point. That's much easier to go back to. So that's one reason I wanted to go back to this. Another reason is this movie in particular has a certain context to its ending that kind of completely changes the vibe of the movie at the last minute, which is something that I felt like was the main reason I didn't like it the first time. Was I was already, there was a lot of stuff I was kind of critical of, but that ending especially just felt like it so completely ruined any vibe it had set up that was sort of light about itself. But I realized when I was seeing it again that watching it again with that context, it does feel like it actually makes more sense and maybe doesn't bring the movie down the way it seemed to when you didn't know it was coming. So, yeah, for those couple of reasons, I wanted to. And I guess the first thing we can acknowledge when we go back is, when I was going back to this, I'd forgotten how much stuff in it I actually liked already, which is kind of summed up, at least most of it is summed up here. We do have an interesting start, because one of the things that I actually kind of liked was the inclusion of the Annabelle Wallace character, where it starts off where she's from the Wall Street Journal, and she's supposed to be interviewing John Hamm about basically his job, and she gets wind of this game and decides that she's going to follow him around and do that. So we kind of get like an audience's perspective within the movie with this character, so I thought that was kind of an interesting addition to have in there. One of the other things I also really like is this whole idea that making like the main focus of the plot the fact that Jeremy Renner hasn't been tagged ever. So they all kind of work together to focus on him. The fact that they really make this a focus actually gives the movie like a trail to stay on and doesn't make it feel like all over the place like it could have. The Jeremy Renner scenes are fantastic. When they kind of play out for fun, like the really over-the-top strategies they would have, like when Renner and Ed Helms have a conversation about how exactly the game of tag would play out if they both got arrested, and it gets like really, really dark. Every now and then there's like a small thing, like at one point, towards the beginning, Jake Johnson, like, dives through a screen door and, like, it destroys the screen. And then Ed Helms, like, walks through it and shuts it properly. Just little things like that are really funny to me. So yeah, I still stand by that stuff being pretty positive about it, and some of those moments being really funny still. So let's kind of go into the stuff that I didn't really care for at the time and see if we can't find something good in there. Obviously there's a lot of jokes in it, but a lot of the jokes are like, some of them just kind of don't land and it's obvious, but then there are the other types that are, they're a joke that doesn't work so much, or it's like just too off or whatever, that it almost doesn't occur to you till like the next scene, oh yeah, they told a joke in that scene, it just didn't really
register that it was a joke because it just didn't go anywhere. Particularly with Hannibal Buress' character.
So as far as jokes not landing, there's many cases where I can stand by that, but I think one problem I had during this was how much promotion there was and just how much focus there was on the idea that this is a true story. And it's the fact that they use that pretty loosely, which is, you know, obviously a given with most movies, especially with a movie like this, you would just suspect that. But I think even though I kind of knew that this must be a particularly exaggerated version of what was actually going on, even though we do see footage that kind of lines up with some scenes actually in the movie, I also talked a lot about how some scenes went really over the top, like the woods scene and a lot of the Renner scenes, even though I praised a lot of the Renner scenes in the original video, but I think my mind was just really stuck on that true story angle, which meant it felt like it was too grounded by that, where it's like if it went even a little bit over the top, I immediately felt like it was out of place because they just really burned the true story thing into my head. So going back and just kind of watching it much more loosely without even really thinking about that was something that I think helped a lot of the comedic scenes work better, and they were easier to kind of accept them as just, you know, it's a heightened comedy and it's a broad comedy and it's going to go to these over-the-top places for the sake of comedy because that's what its job is as a movie. So I feel like that's something that I harped on maybe a little too much. And as far as the stuff that I didn't care for, some of the stuff I didn't mention, like, there's one particular joke where something just goes on too long when they talk about they're debating if Jeremy Renner's actually at his house or not, and they're trying to decide if that's too obvious or if it's he actually is there because it seems too obvious. And they kind of run in circles with this, and it's supposed to get funnier as it goes, but it just kind of gets more tired as it goes. There's a running joke with the bartender who keeps wanting to get in on the game, and they don't really... For a running joke, they don't really add to it. There's the one scene in the middle where he tries to get into the van, and Isla Fisher, like, shuts it on him, and he runs into it. But then we do that joke again of the bartender wanting to get back in the game, and it's just the same thing it was before. So that's one of those jokes that doesn't really go anywhere. Interesting thing about Hannibal Buress, where I still stand by that I'm still not into the Hannibal Buress scenes, but if you can even call them scenes, they're like lines occasionally. And I kind of go into more detail in the video about how most of his lines just seem really disconnected and out of place. And how he's basically, like, they were just trying to go for one-liners in general, like memorable one-liners, whether they were connected or not. And how they kind of went off Burris' sort of persona, where it's like, where he sees a truth that nobody else sees, where he uses it, like, that just kind of seems to be his gimmick, and you look at stuff like how he was the one that kind of brought Cosby to everybody's attention again, and obviously his face is probably most famous to people now for being the "Why you booing me? I'm right" meme. So you can get where there's kind of something similar there, and they were trying to kind of insert that into the movie, I guess. But then something came up, which is apparently this was around the time the movie came out, and typically I try to discourage people from going to Reddit for movie discussion, but I just happened to come across this. And it was this sort of conspiracy, I guess, that went around the time the movie came out, of if Hannibal Buress was actually originally in the movie or if he was inserted to it after the fact. So when you look at this Reddit post by Lairbird33, he says, he's talking about how his friends came up with the idea of maybe he was inserted at the last minute. So the explanation is, they're completely convinced that the entire movie has been shot without Hannibal Buress. Their guess is that early studio reactions and test audience screenings were poor because of lack of diversity and not enough humor, so they hired Hannibal Buress and shoehorned him into the movie after the fact using a mixture of green screen, standalone reaction shots, and a few reshoots featuring the entire cast. In watching the movie, they couldn't help but notice that Hannibal often isn't in the mix with the rest of the cast, or is off to the side in some shots, almost like he's been digitally added. The movie frequently cuts away to him giving off-kilter one-liners seemingly tagged on after the fact. It almost seems like his character serves no real purpose to the plot, as it mostly revolves around Jeremy Renner, Jake Johnson, Ed Helms, and John Hamm. And then, I would just dismiss this, but as you see at the bottom, he adds, Jake Johnson, Hannibal, and the director have now acknowledged this theory on Instagram. It's safe to assume their contracts prevent them from elaborating, but I'll take their lack of denial as confirmation. um, the unfortunate thing about this is that link to Instagram is dead now, apparently. But I'm very curious exactly how that acknowledgement went, but I think I'm also kind of sold on this, because like I said, it just kind of felt like that vibe anyway, but I never really considered it as an actual thing. And like I said, usually these fan theories and conspiracy theories and stuff like that are just kind of whatever, and I don't pay attention to them. But I'm genuinely willing to buy that this is a total possibility, because Hannibal Buress might as well not even be in this movie. There's also something else here about certain jokes that I was not too keen on.
But then they also try to go big, and it's in the way that, like, they realize they're making a big comedy. There's enough language in it that it's already going to be rated R anyway, so they probably thought, well, we're making an R-rated comedy, might as well add some raunchy stuff, just because. And it feels really out of place. Like, there's not even a lot in there. I think actually makes it seem even more out of place when it does happen. And it's kind of like, that honestly feels like a joke from another movie. Anytime you see something that's supposed to be, like, dirty or whatever.
So I think what I'm clearly referring to here is one joke in particular, which is a continuation of what we were just talking about, the scene when they can't decide if Renner's actually at his house or not. And Renner tricks them into thinking that he's in Ed Helms' childhood room, and that he's going to jerk off onto his childhood teddy bear, and to lure them to this location. And that is something that seems very out of place and really, like, it. I know the idea is that Renner's character Jerry is taking all this to the extreme, but that scene is still really weird to me, and like it's weird to me that they found it believable that that's the direction he would go, that's how far he would go. But it does have a decent payoff as far as him not actually being there, and it was the whole setup. And it brings in one of Hannibal Buress' only good lines, which was something like, the masturbation was fake, but the pleasure was real. Is actually a really good addition. Like, that's a good sort of capper to that joke, and that's, like, Hannibal Buress' best contribution to this, I think. As far as anything, like I said, there wasn't much in there at all. That's another thing that makes it really stand out, that they kind of went super raunchy when they weren't otherwise. The other closest thing here is with Thomas Middleditch, where he keeps just making dick jokes, and that goes on, like, during his introduction scene and then through to the next scene, and even the characters are like, why do you keep making sexual jokes? Which, honestly, the characters acknowledging it makes it even worse, because it's already not great jokes, and then for characters to acknowledge jokes is kind of supposed to amplify them, but it's only just serving to further drive it into the ground when it's a joke that didn't work to begin with. So that's just a weird area of the movie, and like I said, still just kind of really sticks out in this weird way.
But there's also the Isla Fisher character. She's Ed Helms' wife. The nice twist that they put on this is the fact that Isla Fisher's character is kind of insane and, like, way too into the game. She's not allowed to necessarily participate, but she is helpful and, like, strategizes and all that, and gives Ed Helms the upper hand when she can. Crazy Isla Fisher is, like, always going to be familiar and always be associated with one particular movie. You just keep having Wedding Crashers flashbacks, more or less.
Yeah, when I went back to it, I was kind of hoping that Wedding Crashers thing wouldn't be hanging on, but it's still something where I kind of only see that when I see Isla Fisher playing a character like this. But something that I didn't mention about her sort of insanity and her intensity is that the fact that she is Helms' wife, and how that they're kind of opposites in that way, where she's, like, really intense, he's a very Ed Helms character, even though Hogan is, like, a very determined character and he is super competitive just like everybody else. We still get those moments, those very Ed Helms moments, where it's like when he's running through the house after Jake Johnson and he's saying, like, sorry nervously to everybody, and the scene I talked about before where he closes the screen door after it's been crashed through. So the idea of that kind of being them kind of completing each other as they go through this, and her kind of being the side that he isn't, and vice versa, kind of makes them, like, one great competitor, which is a really nice addition, I feel like. And also, something that I didn't bring up was the idea that her, as far as the ending, which I really only criticized in that video, now adding the context of the ending and what we know and what they know as a married couple, also kind of adds another layer to her extra determination to make sure this game not necessarily only goes in his favor, but that the game just continues and continues at the intensity that it always has and doesn't feel like maybe a lackluster version of what it like used to be. So it's like her way of like really trying to keep the game alive for him also is actually kind of touching in retrospect.
That is countered by the Leslie Bibb character, unfortunately. Just when you get relieved that there isn't, a wife character or whatever saying, like, you need to grow up, you need to stop the game or whatever. That's pretty much what Leslie Bibb's here to do. It does feel like it waters itself down too much when they go through the whole agreement of certain places they're not allowed to tag Jeremy Renner while he prepares for his wedding and all that.
That idea that the amendments water down the game is actually something I could probably comfortably walk back on. If anything, I feel now like it's kind of the opposite, where it actually makes the game a little more interesting. That they have more rules against them to where they can't tag Jerry, and how that sort of... Another one of my complaints was how that kind of added to the conflict and how I felt like that was kind of forced. But that's actually kind of done in, I feel like, by the little twist that happens, where it turns out that Leslie Bibb has been in on it the whole time, and she's not even pregnant, and they do the whole fake miscarriage thing. I think one of the reasons I avoided that also was that I didn't want to, like, spoil it at the time, but the idea that not only is that, like, one of the more ballsy jokes in the movie, and the fact that they actually go that far and how surprisingly dark it is, I also love the way I remember feeling genuinely fooled by the scene where she seems to be having a miscarriage, because it was like, number one, it was like, no way they're gonna pull a joke this dark. Maybe she just got overly stressed out and she's not actually miscarrying or anything like that. And then the way they figure it out, like right beforehand, where they say like, you know what, I'll bet she was in on it. I'll bet this whole thing was planned and it's this whole big ruse. And when we get that far into them figuring it out, is when you start to think, oh, so it's probably real then. Like, it's probably... They're going to go and they're going to humiliate themselves even further, and it's going to go that route. And then, sure enough, in the next scene, they're, like, at this wedding party, and it was all fake. And she's throwing it in their faces. That's a really good twist. And really genuinely unexpected. Like I said, the way they built it up was really well done. I also like the amendments bit in general because of when we see like the giant book of them and you see like the different sort of various forms of writing and paper that they've written on, like kind of suddenly as they make rules as they go along. So yeah, I actually kind of like the amendments addition to the whole thing.
There's also the Rashida Jones character that's basically... And not only does she just kind of bring the movie to a standstill whenever she's here, and you could pretty much take her out of it and it wouldn't matter. She's basically, when she's introduced, you sort of immediately can know there's one too many characters now. Like, we really don't need another character at this point. And of course, they bring her in for a love triangle.
This is another thing that I can pretty much stand by, where there's really no reason for this character. It is kind of a nice sort of second twist that Jerry kind of put her up to it and was causing turmoil with them intentionally, but it does feel like, as far as them going down the love triangle path that was really unnecessary, it did kind of feel like it was pretty solely for the purpose that they didn't feel like they were doing enough with Jake Johnson and John Hamm compared to the other characters, compared to Helms and Renner. So it was like they felt like they needed to give them more to do or something. I don't know. I felt like the comedic vibe they were bringing to the movie was enough, which, makes perfect sense because it's a comedy, but I guess they needed to add this other story factor to it. It's still probably my least favorite part of the movie. It wasn't as much of a section of the movie as I was remembering. Like, it actually... There's very little time devoted to it, but that honestly makes it all the more pointless in retrospect. So, and though I will say there's one thing, though, is that I feel like this only further strengthens the argument that Hannibal Buress was not supposed to be in this movie, because it's like Ed Helms has his thing going on, Renner has his thing going on, so the only reason Rashida Jones needs to be here is to give Jake Johnson and John Hamm more to do. So still, nobody... You could have given Hannibal Buress something else to do. You could have given him a little side plot, but no, once again, he's pretty much the only person that doesn't have that, so I think that only further strengthens that argument. And now we come to the thing that completely changes the perspective of the entire movie.
If there's one thing that really does kind of seem to do the movie in, it's that in, like, I get it if it's going to be, like, with the way the setup is and the plot, you think eventually it's going to get to a point to where they're, like, they realize that they're, like, having a midlife crisis or whatever, they need to grow up, and, you know, they're adults now and kind of come to terms with that, and it's going to be, like, really depressing, but also kind of, like, you know, hopefully we can still be friends and go all this. You expect that, but that's not exactly where the dramatic point is and what it is. Number one, because it goes probably way more dramatic than you're expecting, and secondly, it's like at the very last minute. Like, I kid you not, it's like the last scene. The big dramatic point is the last scene of the movie. That is how last minute it just suddenly is in this big comedy. And there's like no hints to it up to this point. They just drop a bomb on us in the last scene that's just so... Where in God's name did that come from? And why end on this?
Alright, so while I understand where this is coming from now, it's still a little bit conflicting, because, for starters, the question still is, what made them want to go this route anyway? Because to my understanding, this wasn't the case with any of the actual real guys that were doing this, as far as I know. So, it was basically used as an emotional turning point, and to get us to this moment at the end. And the conflicting thing is, as far as it being literally the last scene all of this is revealed, and how last minute it feels to do something this dramatic in a comedy, at the same time, if this is the route they had to go, which is, like, that's the whole other can of worms, but now that they've made the decision this is going to be what the emotional turning point is, and put the whole game into perspective, if you do it before the ending, that puts a real downer on the third act itself. Like if the whole third act was going to be after this was revealed and then what comes next, the movie becomes a bummer really fast. So it's like they tell us what's going on, and then they do their best to end triumphantly, with all of them still running around and, you know, hopefully getting as much, you know, life together as they can. And so that's nice, but at the same time, and maybe it's, you know, a more idealistic way to look at it or whatever, but they kind of already had a triumphant ending, and they went with the fake-out route instead, where he runs up, like, right as the wedding is coming to a close, and he tags Renner, and everybody laughs and cheers, and they hug, and that's it. And I don't know, am I out of line for thinking that could have just been the end of the movie? Because like I said, I don't think this comes from real life in any way. This is all the movie of Hogan is probably going to die in a year or less, and this will be their last month to do this. And that, like I said, I get as far as the context, where I was saying it comes from out of nowhere and there's no hints. When you know, that's not entirely true. Because there's one moment where they play it up as a joke, and it's where, right at the beginning there, when he's in John Hamm's office, and he's saying, you know, we get Jerry or we die. And the joke in that moment is, oh man, he's taking this way too seriously, and he, like, comes down, and it's like, yeah, that was too much, or whatever. And then you look at it in retrospect, and it's pretty literal, especially since Hogan's the one that says that. So that kind of puts a dark damper on that moment. But then we have scenes later, like, when he's smoking weed with Jake Johnson, and it's like, they're talking about how he's never done it before, and this is him, like, kind of taking down a new path, and it's like, you can see Hogan in these moments when you have the full context, you know, taking in all these things he never tried before, and doing these crazy things he, you know, was trying to avoid before, and now he can just embrace whatever because he's got nothing to lose. That brings a new context to that. I talked before about how, Isla Fisher's determination is basically her trying to give her husband the best last game of tag possible, which is great. There's also that moment, I want to say it's after the woods scene, after they all get, like, really fucked up, and she, like, really sincerely says, "Are you okay?" And it's like, in that moment, you kind of see it as, oh, yeah, they just got fucked up in the woods by Renner. But it's like her saying, in your condition, are you okay? And that's why it's so sincere. So that has a totally different context. So it's like the clues are in there subtly, but it still feels like a really big dramatic turn. But and I think they also build it up nicely with There's also the scene where Hogan has a full meltdown and he tears the room apart because he can't tag Jerry, and it's like this sort of like tagging Jerry like is a bucket list thing at the end of this, and the fact that he might not reach that before he dies, and he can't let anybody else know about this. You can see, and just in general, the idea of unfairly potentially dying prematurely in less than a year, just kind of seeing him rage, makes sense emotionally. It's the fact that it's completely kept from us, the audience, that makes everything seem. Like I said, it's two different movies when you know and when you don't know what's going on. So, which is another reason I felt that it really needed to be revisited. So, there is like kind of a movie in here about sort of grieving your own, life that's going to end prematurely if you're looking at the movie from Hogan's perspective and really Isla Fisher's perspective. And then to bring it in as these moments of these last moments that friends are going to have together, we get that little montage about how the game is so important to them and how they've been doing the tagging thing even in like really crucial moments in life. Like there's particularly a moment that's maybe somewhat a bit of foreshadowing where they're at Ed Helms' dad's funeral and Jake Johnson tags him, and it's this moment where it seems like it's like, oh god, it's going to be inappropriate, but they all laugh about it. Like it brought them comfort in these really, big life moments. And so I get where it's coming from with the context. So in a way, it's actually hits a lot harder when you're watching it again, and how those hints actually were there. So there is something here, but I'm still not sure how it meshes with the rest of the movie being so over the top and such a broad comedy. It still feels like you could have had an emotional reason for the game to be so important to them, especially now. But to go above and beyond the whole "we just need to grow up" kind of thing, it was a pretty extreme path to do that. But it still brings us some really good moments. I especially love the development with Jerry when the idea that he's never been able to be tagged is kind of symbolic of how he felt in the friend group and how he felt like he wasn't as part of the group, and that's why he's been at kind of a distance. That's why they weren't initially, supposed to be at the wedding or to even know about it. Was he just didn't feel close to them because he thought there was just always a distance between them. And it's like there's using the game of tag as a symbolic thing regarding their friendship. There's something in this movie that's actually working on an emotional level. Like I said, it's just a matter of the rest of the movie. But like I said, watching it with a different context and knowing everything that's going on does make it a totally different movie. So there is something I appreciate in here now a lot more than I did when I first saw it. It's still kind of messy, and it's still kind of tonally off the wall, but like I said, it's easier to come back to now, and I do like it a lot more, and I do like that, it has those sincere moments in it. Usually in a comedy, it can be hard to pull those off without completely detouring yourself. We just talked about that recently with No Hard Feelings. We had a whole conversation about it. But like I said, as it goes on, like with many comedies, the more it sticks around, the more it kind of grows on me. So I don't think I'm gonna love it and turn around on it as much as I did Game Night. But I might come back to Tag occasionally. Because it's fun when it's fun, and it's sincere when it's sincere. So it's got all that stuff going for it. So I think we can end this here. The next time we do this segment, we're going in a completely different path again. We're going to do two movies, but it's not a versus I did, and they're not movies that kind of came out together. They were like 2 years apart, but they're two movies I feel like go hand in hand, and I didn't give them near the praise that I should have, so we're gonna take care of that. One of them ended up winning Best Picture after I reviewed it, so we're going to look at it in that context too. But yeah, and then we've got a little bit more of September going on here, and then October, where a lot of fun stuff is. So until all that stuff, I think that's it.